So good morning. This is Robert Stanier. I'm the vicar at St Andrews St Mark's Surbiton. But good morning to everyone at St Peter's Norbiton, and or whenever you're watching this. And what I'm going to be looking at today is the story of David and Goliath in the Old Testament. So it's the 17th book of 1 Samuel, if you want to have a look at it. And it's set for today, and it's an amazing story to look at because, on the one hand, everyone knows the story of David and Goliath. Even people who are not Christians, people who've never been to church, they'll know roughly what happens with David and Goliath. I guarantee you, in the next 4 days, at some point during the Euros, one of the commentators will talk about a David and Goliath story. And what the commentator will mean is that plucky little Wales are playing someone like Italy or one of the big nations. And so, of course, Wales are David and Italy are Goliath. And that's what we understand by David and Goliath story, is when the little guy wins, and maybe wins against a big bully or an established opponent. And what I've been struck about when I've been rereading the story for this sermon is it's how confident David is. And so what I'm going to talk about in this sermon is why David is so confident, and how this leads to success, because there is a reason behind his confidence, but also how this sows problems. And so I want to explore at the end, it sounds really weird, the problems of success, or the problems of being kind of outstanding, because weirdly it does bring with it problems, and it's all in the thread of this David and Goliath story. So we're starting at verse 32, but just to fill you in, so what's happened before is that the Philistines' army is against the Israelite army. Israel has a king, their first king, who's King Saul, and they're really struggling because the Philistines have this new astonishing champion, and David is the youngest son of Jesse, and initially he's just been sent, I think, to give him some sandwiches or something, to pass on some sandwiches. He's sent by Jesse to the other ones. But he turns up at the battlefield, and this is what David hears. So David hears they're struggling, and David says to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." So far, so logical. He's keen as mustard, this boy, but Saul wisely holds him back. And then David says this: "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or bear came and took the lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down. And so he goes on, and then if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he's defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will save me from the head of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." And so Goliath has made this challenge, and David has got the living God on his side and Goliath doesn't. So you could say, well, of course he's going to win. But it's not just that. It's not just blind faith behind David's understanding. David has got a conception of how he is going to win. And he is, if you like, finding a new application for a technique that he is very good at, but which the military people seem to have missed out on. Which is that it doesn't matter how small or big you are if you're very good at a slingshot, because with a sling and a stone, you don't have to get into hand-to-hand combat. You can just hit them from a distance. And if you think about it like that, of course David's going to win. Of course David's going to win. It's like, in the old days when with the British Empire, we'd go out and they would send out their finest kind of Zulu warriors against us. But then if you've got a load of machine guns, it doesn't matter how strong or mighty or brave the opposition is if they're only fighting you with mangoes. It's impossible. Of course they're going to win. So David is saying, well, it doesn't really matter if he's strong with a sword and a spear. I can avoid a javelin throw, and I'm going to get him with my slingshot. I suppose the point would be, David kind of knows he's going to win because he has got a technique which is better than the one Goliath is using. And sometimes just new techniques win. Here's a grim example, but once you had the idea, as Osama bin Laden did, that you could use a plane to fly into the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, and you've got people who are prepared to die, those pilots are prepared to die to do it, then this thing which has never been, no one ever thought planes were a threat. Planes were things which got people from A to B. Okay, a bomb was a threat or a missile was a threat, but a plane's not a threat. But once you had that twist in your brain, suddenly not only is it possible, but once you switch that button, you're almost certain you're going to win, because there was nothing stopping it, was there? There was nothing stopping this happening. It's very easy for the plane to hit the Twin Towers. So it's like if you make a technological shift, they didn't invent anything. They didn't invent planes. David doesn't invent slingshots. At the time, everyone would have seen people, boys, shepherd boys, chasing lions and whatnot with slings. But David reapplies the technique. And so it's going to win. And reapplying techniques is therefore this massively successful aspect of life. And then it goes on. And this is an interesting bit. Saul clothed David with his armour. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armour, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, I can't walk in these, for I am not used to them. So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi, and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So even though David's explained how he's going to do it, Saul thinks he's doing David a favour by cladding him in the best armour possible. But Saul still missed the point. He hasn't seen it. He's just thinking, oh my goodness, he's just this crazy brave youth. I can at least give him my best armour. If he puts the best armour on, then he's not going to be able to wield the kind of slingshot, is he? So it just shows how hard it is to get your head round a new technique. David wins him over with words, but he hasn't really understood Saul. He hasn't really understood. And David has to say, no, thank you, Saul. Thank you very much. I'm not going to need that. I'll just use these stones. And belt and braces, I might miss the first time, so I've got 4 spare after that. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field. But David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So, of course, David knows his God is real. So a curse by Goliath's God, well, who cares? You can curse whatever you like, because that's unrealistic. And he allies his technological insight with his understanding of Yahweh, the true God. When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly across the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. And so it works. It works. And that's the end of the passage we got. But the interesting bit, in a way, then comes after. And the next 5-10 minutes, I want to explore this afterlife. It is very hard to deal with extremely talented people. It sounds, crazy. Everyone would love an extremely talented person. No, it is very hard to deal with it. And this is shown here. Because initially, David is Saul's deliverance. David is the guy who saves Saul, saves all the Israelites, turns around the Philistine armies, and the next chapter will show that David, Saul says, you can be the leader of of my armies, and David has success after success. And then there's this very kind of telling bit at the beginning of, let me get this, it's the beginning of chapter 18. So they were coming home when David had returned from killing the Philistines, and the women came out of all the towns of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, songs of joy, and musical instruments. So far, so good. And the women sang to one another as they made merry. Saul has killed thousands. Still so far so good. Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. And you know why he's angry. Because Saul is used to being the top dog. And now there is someone who is more talented and more acclaimed. And also you have to get into a little bit of the real politics here. Saul's been made a king, but this is a very unsettled position. And this is true of, monarchies, well, at all times, till very recently. They're kind of risky business. And there's no, your own children kind of have a good chance, but if they get muscled out by someone, then they're not going to stand a chance. And I always think if you read this bit of the Old Testament, you've got to think the film The Godfather. It's like mafia bosses, and who is the one who can outdo the others. And suddenly there is this new kid on the block, David, and he is getting the acclaim. And it starts being out of Saul's control. It's out of control, and from this point he realizes he wants to gun David down. And at first, when you first read this, it's kind of Saul bad, David good. How could Saul treat David so badly? But let's look at the evidence. If you read it carefully, read these books carefully. Of all Saul's sons and descendants, every single one of them, bar one, is killed as a result of David's actions. David never has his finger on the trigger. He always gets someone else to do it for him somehow. So when Saul's, he gets killed by an army on the mountain at the end of Mount Gilboa, I think, at the end of the book, David happens not to be there. He's like mysteriously with the Philistines somewhere there. Sometimes it's Joab who does it for him. Somehow it's some other person. The only one who survives is Mephibosheth, who is crippled, is a disabled person. And I think he's so disabled that with the thing at the time, David didn't regard him as a threat. Otherwise, every single one of Saul's descendants, his sons die, and everyone dies. They all die because of David. And so if you think of it like that, Saul has got a reason to be paranoid. He has got a reason to be paranoid about David's success. This is not just him being jealous. This is Mafia Don world. If the other one is more popular and more powerful than you, you're going to go down. And he does go down. Okay, this is all very well. Thank you very much for taking me through the Old Testament, Robert. That's all very well. What I think is interesting is that that's the Old Testament, but really we do struggle in institutions in dealing with particularly talented people because they kind of upset the order of things. And in turn, things go wrong when David himself becomes king, because he kind of gets a big head and he starts taking Bathsheba from, he thinks he can take whoever he wants, and in turn his own children turn against him, and it's wildly problematic reign of kind of disorder, and there's coups and heaven knows what. It's a gripping read, by the way, if you ever get into 1 and 2 Samuel. It's an astonishing set of books to read. But it's not going well. And I think part of the point that is being made in the Old Testament is that getting government right is not easy, whether that's like a king, and that's the primary model you got here, but any way you do it, it is a problem with how to do it as the kind of swings of popular mood come in and out. And certainly it's the case that Israel hasn't done it well. And so on the one hand, you have in the David and Goliath story this mind-boggling triumph. It's a total success of the little guy against the big bad monster. Israel is saved. On the one hand, it's a dream ticket for Saul and everyone else. On the other hand, this moment on the surface has saved them, but in the long run has sealed their own destruction. And that is really is something you've got to get your head around. You can't just read this as just, go Israel, bad Philistines, they're so stupid. It's about someone who's had astonishing insight. So he has a technological insight, he has amazing faith, David, and he has bravery and courage, and he has huge charisma. But when it comes to it, this leads to massive, massive problems. And I think we just have to think carefully about how we hang on to people with talent, and how we can actually be more flexible with our institutions to make them work for us.